Hello and welcome to a step-by-step tutorial on how I created this Flower Night gauntlet. This was for the November edition of my print club, which you can join if you'd like to receive monthly fantasy art, and also of course subscribe to my YouTube if you'd like to see more tutorial content. So diving straight in, I took my own reference photos for this, and I often do take my own reference photos because one, I have no issues with copyright or anything like that, but I also find that I have such a specific idea that it's easier to do something myself rather than try and find the exact match. And once I'd chosen my reference photo, I took it into Procreate on my iPad, although you could use any drawing app for this, or you could print it out and you could do it on paper. And I began to trace the shape of a gauntlet over the top of my hand. And I didn't have any specific reference for the gauntlet itself. This was kind of just from my imagination and from, I guess, my memory of previous gauntlets that I've seen. But I essentially kind of made everything a little bit angular, a little bit more sectioned, and just thought about where the layers would be on something that's kind of bending around your fingers. But I wasn't aiming for accuracy with this, I was thinking more about aesthetics than anything else, so the exact kind of like the precise mechanics of it doesn't really matter. Once I had got my rough shapes sketched out, I made my reference layer invisible and then used my new reference layer, which was that initial sketch, to just kind of refine the lines a little bit. And you don't technically have to do this, but I find it useful to kind of refine things and maybe move things around a little bit at this stage without necessarily having to change that bottom layer. And then I just went in and added some details that would kind of give more of a 3D shape to it. Again, these weren't particularly accurate, it was just more aesthetics based, because this is essentially just a sketch, really. Then for the flower, I didn't really need my reference photo underneath this, but I put it on anyway, and if you did want to draw a specific flower, you might find it useful to trace that initial reference. And I want to make it clear, and this is something I've talked about in other videos in the past on my social media, that tracing, if you are tracing your own reference photos, that is not a problem. That is completely acceptable. I often trace my own reference photos and then trace those sort of reference sketches that I've made from that, particularly for commissions where getting stuff accurate and proportions right is really important. It just speeds up the process. It doesn't mean you can't draw, it just means you're trying to make things more efficient for you and make your process easier. And I think that's never an issue. It is not a problem to trace. Just don't go tracing other people's work, because that is not cool, and that is not why we're using tracing. We are using tracing to speed up the process, not to copy something else and steal someone else's work. So yeah, with that sketch done, it was time to actually trace this onto a piece of paper. And you don't have to do this, but because I was trying to do this under relatively tight time constraints, and I've already drawn the sketch, why would I not make this quicker for myself, right? So what I do is I turn my brightness fully up on my iPad. I lock it onto like guided access, which is in the accessibility tab, and then I put a piece of paper over it and trace it through. And that is the same as using a light box or a projector or anything like that. It does the same thing. Do whatever works for you. Then I just use a kneadable eraser to lighten some of those lines. For this, I probably didn't need to do that as it is going to be quite sketch-like, but definitely if you want it to be a little bit fainter on the sketch, it's definitely worth using a kneadable eraser. And with the sketch finished, it was time to think about painting. And for the idea I had in mind, I only really need two different colours, and that is quinacridone magenta. I never know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a really nice pink colour. And that is going to be for the flower and maybe a couple of highlights, wasn't quite sure at this stage. And then for the black or the grey of the gauntlet, I'm using neutral tint. Now, neutral tint is probably my most used colour. It's the one I buy most frequently, and it essentially replaces black and grey in my palette. And since I discovered this colour, I use it all the time. For brushes, I'm going to be using a size 1 mop brush. So it's got quite a pointed tip, but it holds a lot of water in the body of the brush. And it's kind of one of my favourite brushes to use because I can get quite fine details, but also cover lots of area with it. And you'll see it in probably most of my paintings, either a mop brush or a kind of bigger round brush. It's just, for me, it feels very versatile, and I really like that you can get quite painterly strokes with it, at the same time as getting some finer details if you do kind of pick the tip up of the paper. And so the first stage of painting was just laying down a base colour with that neutral tint. And you'll see here I'm not trying to make it even. In fact, I am trying specifically to make it kind of textured and uneven, because I think that's one of the most beautiful qualities of watercolour. It's kind of what I think makes my style kind of characteristic. You can be the judge of that. But you can see here all of those blooms where the water has moved into drier areas, and those are one of my favourite things about watercolours. Moving on to the flower, and I'm going to move down to a slightly smaller brush size here. This is a round brush, and I don't necessarily have to do that, but it's just a little bit easier to control. And we're using that magenta here, and just the same as the gauntlet, we're laying down a base color. I don't mind if it's uneven, I don't mind if there are blooms. If you're using a granulating color, I think that would also look really cool. And then I'm just going to try and start to darken some of the areas that I think would be darker. So, for example, that's going to be closer to the base of the flower, kind of in where all those petals are still furled up. But you'll notice that I am adding quite concentrated pigment into parts, and the aim of that is so that we get some really cool effects at the end. You can see here, now that it's dry, that there was a really nice bloom in there, and those are the sort of effects that I am trying to go for in this sort of sketchy painting. Then it was time to start building up some layers on the gauntlet itself. And again, I'm back to using my neutral tint for this, back to using the mop brush as well, and I'm just defining some shadows. Again, because I don't have a reference, this is not particularly accurate, but I'm just thinking about, where the different layers of the metal are, where is kind of shielded by the base of the hand, and just sort of plotting them out. Again, not this point being very specific. I did think a little bit about lighting, maybe adding some pink to the kind of highlighted surface just to reflect that flower and kind of bring the whole thing together and make it more cohesive. And then I decided to go back in with an even smaller brush and refine some of those shadows even more. And you will find that when you switch to a smaller brush that doesn't hold as much water, you'll get a lot sort of more pigmented, a lot darker areas because you're not diluting it with so much water. And obviously, you could add more water if you wanted to, but at this point, I'm really trying to define the painting a little bit better. And yeah, using this smaller brush really helps me do that. I can also use it for kind of line work if I want to, but at this point, it's still just about building layers and getting the whole sense of the painting rather than focusing in on fine details. The same goes for the flower, where I just want to make it a little bit more vibrant, a little bit darker in places, and then you can just go back over the whole thing and adjust as you see fit. This is why I like to work on the whole painting in one go rather than finishing one section and then kind of going to another one. I feel that by working in layers, particularly since I'm not working directly from a reference, it's a lot easier to keep consistent over the whole thing with things like contrast. And with that, the body of our painting is pretty much done, and I'm going to move on to using a pen to just refine some details, add some line work, and just kind of define the whole thing and add some interest. And you may have noticed if you frequently watch any of my videos on social media that I have been enjoying a little bit more mixed media work recently. It's not something I used to do a lot of, but at the moment I'm just kind of enjoying experimenting, and I think, especially with this sort of sketchier style, adding some line work with a pen or pencil even can just, I don't know, it can just really help define something that otherwise was quite quick and sketchy. And I think as well, it's a more approachable way of doing things. I think a lot of people feel intimidated by doing details in watercolor, but pen, for some reason, or pencil even more so, feels a lot more approachable. And I enjoy doing that in my own work when I'm experimenting and trying new things. And it's also a little bit quicker than details with watercolor, I think, which I think, again, I am not someone who's particularly patient, can feel a little bit more freeing and relaxing than having to focus in for hours and hours on details. I think realistically you can outline something a lot quicker with pen or pencil than you could with watercolor. And now it is on to the final few details. I just wanted to fill in that stem. I initially was going to leave it white and then it didn't really look right, so I changed it to pink. And then I used some white gouache to add some highlights. And again, I'm not being particularly careful with this placement, I'm not being super technical. It's just a nice way to add a little bit more definition and finish things off. So yeah, that is this sketchy watercolor and pen illustration done. As I said, this was for the November edition of my print club. This became the sticker design. If you would like to join that, if you're not already a member, depending on where I share this, you can find it on my website or my Patreon. And yeah, let me know if you would like more tutorials like this, where I kind of go over the whole process, but without taking hours, because I know that I struggle to watch things that take really long time, but I know some people much prefer that really in-depth, literally step by step, like layer by layer approach. So yeah, let me know what you like. Do subscribe to my YouTube if you're not already, and yeah, hopefully see you again soon for another tutorial.